Hey there, Professor Dyer here, talking about research in human development and family science. We've talked already about selection bias as a form of sampling bias, but what about non-response bias? What is that? How is that different? Non-response bias is a systematic difference between those who eventually participate in the study, who become the sample, and the people who are invited to participate. This one is produced by the subject's right to decide whether or not to participate. Almost all research requires informed consent, so almost always subjects have the right to say, thanks but no thanks, I don't want to do this. And so they have the right to not respond, essentially. And the people who choose not to respond might be different from the people who do respond. And so that is the essence of a non-response bias. Remember that your population of interest is the group of people about whom you're theoretically interested, let's say parents of newborns. But we don't have access to all parents of newborns in the universe, so we have to identify a sampling frame. And there we might choose a particular hospital and parents who gave birth in that hospital at a certain time frame. And that might be our sampling frame. But from within that sampling frame, we have to decide, do we invite all of them, or do we sample from them and only invite, let's say, a random selection of people in the sampling frame? And so we send out all those invitations, and then people have the right to say yes or no. The people who say yes end up in the smallest circle there in the sample, and the people who say no don't. So are those two groups of people different from each other? Well, certain non-response biases are well known in HDFS. We know that if the research is about children or interpersonal relationships, women are more likely than men to agree to participate. This creates problems for us. Are the women the best responders? They may be, they may not be. We don't know because we don't get to talk to many of the men. Can women really speak for men in the issue of relationships? Probably not a great idea, right? We should let men speak for themselves. But if we don't have them in the sample, then we have a non-response bias because men are less likely to agree to participate. So gender is one form of non-response bias that we see especially in HDFS. One that is not specific to HDFS is known as volunteer bias, and this is a personality issue. Some people have personality traits that incline them to want to do stuff like that. They don't mind talking to somebody about their personal life. Sure, they're kind of curious. They'd like to know what happens in a study. They tend to be sort of sociable. They don't mind talking to strangers. Those personality traits lead people to participate in research. This doesn't bother anyone as long as your research question doesn't have anything to do with this. But if your research question has something to do with personality, agreeableness, then volunteer bias is going to be a big problem for you. But it's almost always present in research that requires informed consent. Finally, there are measurement and topical preferences, and these are hard to identify in advance. But what I mean by that is some people will do an interview, but they won't do a questionnaire. They hate questionnaires. Other people say, I don't mind a questionnaire. I can do it at home while I'm sitting at my kitchen table, but I don't want to go anywhere for an interview. That's just a pain in the neck, right? So they may agree to one form of measurement, but not another. And so non-response bias might be related to the form of measurement that was used. Similarly, it might be related to the topic. Some topics are very sensitive, and people might think, I don't have anything to say about that topic since it's never happened to me. Or maybe it has happened to them and they think, I don't really want to tell people about what was one of the worst experiences of my life, right? So when we send out invitations to participate in research about things, especially if it's going to be sensitive, like maybe intimate partner violence or cheating in a college class, people might choose whether to participate or not based on what the topic is. If it's very sensitive, you might get a lot of non-response because people don't want to talk about that. On the other hand, there are some topics that people sort of do want to talk about. I study infant sleep, and for people who have had an infant sleep is a pretty important topic, and most are eager to talk about their experiences in parenting, and eager to sort of learn something perhaps in the process. So they sign up for a study like that, but they might not sign up for a study of something like abuse of an infant. People will say, nah, if I've done it, I don't want to talk about it, and if I haven't done it, I think it doesn't apply to me. So there are these topic preferences that might create non-response biases. How can the reader tell if there's a non-response bias? Essentially, we can look at the response rate. How many people were invited, and how many of those agreed to participate? That is the response rate. It'll be written as a percentage. It can be used as an indicator of non-response bias. So when the response rate is high, say 90% of people invited agreed to participate, then you don't really have any non-response bias. It would be very minimal. But if your response rate gets down to 20 or 30%, you have to ask yourself, why did 70 or 80% of people say no? And that suggests a bigger problem with non-response bias. What are the implications of both non-response bias and selection bias for the sample of a study? When there is sampling bias of either kind, then generalizability of the study is more limited. When we suspect or know that there's a difference between the people who participated and the people we wanted to participate, then we know that we may not be able to generalize these findings to those people who did not participate. So you have to be really careful as a reader not to generalize something beyond the sample that was actually involved in the research, unless you have good reason to think that there's that's a reasonable thing to do. But the more sampling bias there is, then the less willing we should be to generalize beyond sort of the exact group of people that were studied. So that's the main thing for the reader to have in mind, is how generalizable are the results of the study. And the more sampling bias, the less generalizable. The second thing, however, to remember is that sampling biases are very important for prevalence studies, because prevalence studies are essentially in the business of counting how often something happens. And so it's very important to answer a question, how common is this in the population? Then you need to be studying the entire population. It's essential to the work that a prevalence study does. But sampling bias is not nearly so relevant in other kinds of studies. It's relevant in a general way to other kinds of studies, but not nearly so important as it is in a prevalence design.